everyone. Welcome. My name's Rafe Larson, and I'm the founder of the Future of Small Cities Institute. What a moment that we find ourselves in. Right now feels like an incredibly vital pivot point for our nation, our cities, and our culture. So I can't think of a better time to have this important dialogue that we're having today. I'd like to begin our conversation today by making a land acknowledgement, which at its core is an act of acknowledging the atrocities and injustices of our past, while also striving for a more just and understanding future. So I'm speaking to you virtually, of course, on the traditional land of the Mohican, or the Mahikonok, the people of the waters that are never still, in a place that was once called Panpak and is now known as Troy, New York. In the spirit of those great stewards of the land and the rivers, may we continue to strive to be better stewards of our own shared resources now and hereafter. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our great partners and allies and sponsors that have helped make this event happen, including the Albany Downtown Bid, the Troy Downtown Bid, the Capital District Regional Planning Commission, the Upstate New York Planning Association, the Community Foundation, and the Troy Innovation Garage. Thank you for your support and all the work that you do in our communities. At this point, you're probably used to all things Zoom, but for those who haven't taken part in this strange dance, this is a webinar, which is slightly different than a normal Zoom meeting. You can't see yourself and you're automatically muted, but you'll be able to see us. Think of us sitting in a large theater with the lights dimmed, and you're actually in your house or your office sipping your coffee. And we're grateful that you're here and you'll have a chance to chime in later. Here at the Future of Small Cities Institute, we seek out just and sustainable solutions for small and mid-sized metro areas. We're studying and documenting the particular challenges and opportunities that small cities face, given their constraints on capacity, but also given their potential for innovation, flexibility, and partnership. This is part 2 in our Recovery and Resilience series, in which we're looking closely at not just how communities can recover in the short term, but how we might establish a long-term culture of resiliency in our cities, in which we will be able to navigate the next crisis or challenge, including the increasingly acute threat of climate change. In part 1 of our series in October, and I think maybe many of you are here with us, we looked at how the pandemic has forced us out of necessity into innovative partnerships and into feats of improvisation. Over the last year, we've been required to reimagine public space, help our small businesses pivot, change our economic models, lean into our neighbors' expertise, open windows, and put on long johns. We appreciate small things now. I don't know about you, but I don't take anything for granted anymore. Today, we look at a crucial part of this equation, that is the systemic inequities in our cities, which have been laid even more bare during this pandemic. Those, those without support systems have suffered the most. Those who lived in overcrowded housing conditions often found themselves in the middle of a COVID outbreak. And those without access to affordable healthcare often did not seek help until it was too late. Those who worked without a steady job have been left behind. Those whose businesses were already on shaky footing or did not have the capacity to pivot have been forced to simply give up. Black Americans are dying from COVID at twice the rate as white Americans. Like so many things in our culture, this statistic is not surprising, but it is shocking still. Yet, as we all know, all of these inequities long predated the pandemic. Our small and mid-sized cities, just like mega cities, have perpetually struggled with inequity. And yet smaller cities don't have the massive budget that large cities have to attempt to address these inequities. Indeed, fighting embedded inequity is one of the most difficult challenges that we as a society face. In many ways, the systems have been designed to perpetuate these inequities. So short of a massive systems overhaul, we are left working at the edges, making small, imperfect gains in what feels like a rigged game. But there is good work to be done, and the tides may be shifting. This past summer, we saw the largest civil rights protests in the history of this nation. New York State recently passed the landmark Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which requires communities to reinvest 40% of our energy savings back into disadvantaged communities. And one of the many reassuring shifts with the new Biden administration that the new Biden administration brings, besides a fundamental belief in science, is an early and extraordinary emphasis on equity in their overall agenda. In a recent New York Times cover article about these new equity measures, Cecilia Rouse, the nominee to lead the Council of Economic Advisors, said, "Racial equity is not a silo in of itself. It is woven into all of these policy efforts." Indeed, this is the challenge of all of our conversations about inclusion and equity, not to simply have them as one-offs, to check a box, but to be ongoing, embedded, and critical to the very foundation of all of our work. Sustainability and resilience is equity. Today, we'll hear from 4 amazing leaders who are all working to address systemic inequities in their communities from a variety of angles. I'm particularly excited that we have representatives from each of the 4 upstate metro areas, what we call the Erie Canal Corridor. I believe one of the keys to future resiliency is to create a network of knowledge sharing across cities, and we're certainly doing that today. I'll introduce each one of them before they make a short presentation. And then after the presentations, we'll have a conversation and then turn to a Q&A from you, the audience. So please write your questions down as they come up in the Q&A window, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Katie Hammond of the Troy Downtown Bid is helping to make everything run smoothly. So big thanks to her. We'll also make a video of today's conversation available to those who have registered for this webinar and distribute some takeaway materials in the coming days. This is meant to be an ongoing conversation, so let's all keep the conversation going. Also, please check out our website for upcoming events. In February, we have our Future of Small Cities Winter Keynote lecture by Catherine Tumber, author of Small, Gritty, and Green. She's great. I really encourage you to come. And in March, we have part 3 of this Recovery and Resilience series on translating talk to action. Then in April, we're putting on a large-scale conference on sustainability, examining how the concept touches upon all aspects of civic life. We're also developing a podcast. The first episode will be on waterfronts, so stay tuned. We're excited to be building our city's futures alongside you. Okay, now let's turn to the main event. Our first speaker, Rahwa Ghirmatzion, is the executive director of Push Buffalo, a community organization that works at the grassroots to create and implement a comprehensive revitalization plan for Buffalo's West Side, with more than 40 million invested in affordable housing, rehabilitation, weatherization, and green infrastructure. Under Rahwa's leadership, Push is at the forefront of the movement for a just transition, from actual design and deployment of solutions to the creation of good green jobs and the advocacy of groundbreaking state policy. Rahwa was born in Asmara, Eritrea, in the middle of a civil war, and came to Western New York as a refugee at the age of 8 with her family after living in Sudan. She is a lifelong artist and activist. So I want to welcome Rahwa.
Hello, everyone. It is so wonderful to be here with you. Thank you, Reef, for that wonderful introduction. So I just wanted to very, very quickly also do a land acknowledgement. I am here on stolen Haudenosaunee land in Buffalo, New York. And I also, wanted to say we are all standing on stolen land, and we should all understand and know what that history is and find ways to reconcile that history, and that this country was, of course, founded by stolen labor from stolen people from Africa. And I think it's really important that we talk about repatriation and reparations to heal this country so that we can move forward, especially as we continue to pivot in where we are in the world. So I will tell you a little bit about Push Buffalo, the organization that I helped to lead with some amazing individuals. Push Buffalo is a local membership-based organization that works in community development. It was founded by 2 organizers, Aaron Bartley and Eric Walker, in 2005. So we're a 15-year-old organization, and our mission is to mobilize residents to create strong neighborhoods with quality, affordable housing, to expand local hiring opportunities, and to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice in Buffalo. Our theory of change revolves around community control of resources, community ownership of resources, and the just transition strategy framework for transformative structural change. Our work, of course, is bottom up and top down, and we work at the local grassroots level by engaging residents to ask them what it is that they want where they live. And we take that learning and implement it for nationwide thought partnership around policies like the Green New Deal and the Thrive Agenda, statewide legislation that, like the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that was passed, and of course at the local level, where we practice what I call a just transition in action, is really pushes Green Development Zone. The Green Development Zone was founded in 2008. It combines green affordable housing construction, community-based renewable energy projects, housing weatherization, green jobs training, green infrastructure, and vacant land restoration, all towards the path of creating employment for our neighborhoods, for our neighborhood folks, as well as reducing our carbon footprint. Now, why is that important? I think for a city like Buffalo, as Rafe was talking about, we're an upstate Rust Belt city that, went through about a 50-year economic decline after being one of the 6 largest economies in the world, but we didn't have a plan B. And so, for Push to have started back in 2005, we were addressing systemic and structural devastation economically. We're also the 6th most segregated city in the nation, the 3rd poorest. And what I always say about our community, and I'm going to share a little quick power presentation in pictures so you can meet the people that are behind me that allow me to do this work, is that we are chronically underestimated and disinvested in. Give me one moment. Okay. I hope everyone can see that. So this is a little bit about Push Buffalo and how we think about resiliency, adaptability, and long-term sustainability. So this is the Just Transition Strategy Framework. This has been adopted by many environmental justice communities across the nation. It was developed really as a direct response to EJ needs around intersectionality and understanding structural issues. And it was created by an organization called the Movement Generation. There are big partners out in the Bay Area. And part of it is really understanding what is the worldview and what is the economy that we're currently living in. And that is kind of out to the left of me, which is this extractive economy, the worldview being consumerism, colonial mindset, fossil fuel extraction, and patriarchy. And then, how do we think about our resources? Well, extraction is about dig, burn, dump, right? And so we see that in all of our models. When you think about what is our purpose, right? With enclosure of wealth at the top and thinking about the 1% and the great inequities that have grown as a result of that. When we think about governance, I think, we have a beautiful constitution and a lot of poetry that we aspire to be, which is that we're a democratic nation, but really more than half of our national budget goes to our military. It's actually, our governance is very much rooted in militarism. And when we think about our labor, right, it's oftentimes exploited. And so how do we then, create a more resilient world? And I would also argue that it's the same extractive economy is what has now led us to the climate crisis. So if we're going to address climate change, the global climate change that we're experiencing, then we really need to move to alternative new economies that are more regenerative, that are rooted in a worldview of caring and sacredness for humanity and each other, that our resources have to be about regeneration and renewable energy, that our work actually has to be built on cooperation and collaboration. Our governance has to be about deep democracy, and our purpose has to be about ecological and social well-being. And as we think about those, how do you do that? That is so massive, it's so big. Well, it's really about drawing down the power to the grassroots and allowing communities to have a level of self-determination in creating more distributed power generation, distributed ways of working in general. And you put that through a values filter. And in a just transition, you must have a shift of economic control to communities, democratize wealth in the workplace, advance resilience and ecological restoration, drive racial justice and social equity, relocalize most production and consumption, and retain and restore cultures and traditions. So much of what we talk about our indigenous communities is restoring it back to that and being in right relationship with ourselves, being in right relationship with our communities, and of course, being in right relationship with the natural world around us. So a little bit about Push and the people of Push, because everything starts with the people, is that we know what we want where we live. And so these great folks here have determined so much of what is happening in the Green Development Zone and have won these big legislations like the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So here are some of our resident leaders and how they play roles in everything that we do. To the left of me is one of our board members who was an avid gardener and actually developed our first community gardens in the community. We've got a young man who grew up across the street and now is helping us build and rebuild these homes. This is him at a training house where we're training men and women in our neighborhood how to actually redevelop and rehab homes and get good jobs. Uh, Down below is the People's Climate March back in 2015 in New York City, one of the largest climate marches. And it was really this event that catalyzed the beginning of New York Renews, the statewide coalition that won the most advanced and equitable climate legislation in the world. And over here, we've got one of our member leaders who became a strong member leader because she was dealing with paying too much for her utilities, living in a home that was not weatherized, and constantly on a loop of generational poverty from having her gas turned off every April and then living without gas or hot water until she can get it turned back on in November. So that it's basically applying through heat. And so she became a strong member leader and then, of course, moved on and became an incredible organizer for us and helped us win big things like the Green Jobs, Green New York legislation around weatherization, where over $120 million got put into a state program to help communities like ours. So this is what the Green Development Zone is, a very arbitrary 25 square block that we selected as the place that we were going to concentrate all of our investments in and learn from. And really, we selected this community because it was the third poorest in the country, where an average household of four was making about $19,000 to $20,000 a year. And then you go over to the right, and you have the Elmwood Village, where the average median income jumps to about $67,000. And here's just some examples of how we think about working in an intersectional way and thinking about resiliency and thinking about what are the jobs of the future. So the jobs of the future need to work better with natural systems. And so green infrastructure as a method to address Buffalo's combined sewer overflow problem. But really, we use it as a workforce opportunity. And you see some examples of that. And the reason for that is 20% of the world's fresh water flows right through our backyards. And we have over 60 combined sewer overflows that dump water when we have, big rain events and or snow melt-offs, where they push raw and treated sewage into the freshwater lake. And we feel rather than invest all of that into great infrastructure, green infrastructure actually creates new opportunities for jobs and operations and maintenance long-term, not just installation. We, of course, believe in green construction trades. So we train men and women in our neighborhoods for the most sustainable green trades in building new homes and construction. Renewable energy projects. So that's solar installation, technicians, operators and maintenance and subscription managers, geowell technicians, new heat pump technology. And then there is Push Green, where we weatherize homes, but also create jobs for men and women in our neighborhood to reduce our energy consumption. And here's just a few ways that we restore our neighborhood. This housing was vacant for about 40 or 50 years. And that entire block was dead, creating unsafe, unwalkable, dangerous neighborhoods. And we have redesigned it to have the most sustainable materials. So things like metal roofs, hardy board plank. These things are able to be recycled at the end of their lives. They create less toxicity and also better insulators. Here's a couple of some of our more innovative training houses. The green one below is the first net zero house that was rehabbed by about 43 men and women in our neighborhood that were able to learn new technologies. And then the home right next to it, as you can see, again, it has everything that the net zero house has, except it doesn't have the geothermal, but it does have radiant heating and solar. So this family of three pays about $17 a month for their electric bills. Other ways of addressing some of the chronic issues in Buffalo are things like green infrastructure. We won a major battle with the Buffalo Sewer Authority, where they kept trying to get their consent decree plan accepted by the EPA. They would not accept it. we were able to very quickly do 12 demonstrations on our own land where we knew we weren't going to build any housing around green infrastructure interventions like rain gardens. We did, green roofs. We did bioswales. We did community gardens, and said, here is a better way of addressing the CSO issue, but also building more green space within our community. We know that reduces stress. It also impacts heat island effect. And it's much more sustainable, but also it's a really great way to generate new jobs, paying living wages to men and women in our neighborhood. And here are just a couple of examples of those sites that we showed them. So we have a permeable parking pad. We've got a beautiful rain garden. We've got a community garden. You see some of our farmers there. And we were able to dig cisterns above and underground to capture stormwater, rainwater, and actually use it to irrigate these interventions. And so what the Buffalo Sewer Authority did is actually love this idea. We trained 4 men and women from our neighborhood, never had any experience in doing this, to actually install these systems. And what we were able to do is get $90 million of the $400 million that was earmarked for great infrastructure to go towards green infrastructure in our community over the next 10 years. This right here is our landmark housing project. It's the renovation of a vacant school building that was built in 1927 called School 77. It took us 4 years. We engaged about over 1,000 community members about what they wanted here. And so the first thing that they wanted us to do was take control of this building. So we were able to purchase it from the city of Buffalo. We, through a series of engagements, settled on 30 affordable senior housing units. We, of course, have multiple businesses that moved in that the community got to select. So the auditorium is now a theater company. The classroom spaces are an inner piece of the city which offers programming for youth from kindergarten all the way to high school, including some social enterprises. And of course, it's the new headquarters for Push Buffalo. And what is beautiful about this building is once we settled on senior housing, the residents were very much interested in intergenerational programming. And so we have a pocket park for young kids. We've got programming that is intergenerational, as well as the campus. The entire campus has green infrastructure. This is something that the seniors got to design on their own, which is those little pellets going around this green roof are very soft recycled tires, so that if anybody falls, they won't be hurt as bad. And also on the roof of that, we had members from our Eco Justice Committee that fought for community solar. So this is the first 100% affordable community solar project in the entire state of New York on School 77, in which the seniors get, they save about $150 a year on their electric bills. So this is just a little bit of the impact that we've been able to make over 15 years, which is $62 million invested in green affordable housing and green infrastructure. More than 1,000 homes have been transferred through weatherization or green retrofit. Over 250 green jobs created and over 450 workers trained in these industries. More than $130 million in new investments in weatherization across the state, and more than 90 million in green infrastructure. And of course, with the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act back in June 2019, we've got 40% of all clean energy investments are going to be redirected to communities like ours to do exactly what Push Buffalo's done, is to think very holistically, not about what is happening right now, but also what is the world that we would like to build, using strategies of engaging communities like ours, which, as I said, we may be poor, but we are resilient, and we actually know what we want where we live, and we have local knowledge and local expertise. That it's really about, when you think about equity and the term equity, these communities are consistently looked at as sacrifice zones through policy. But what I would say in fairness is that they are underestimated and underinvested in. But when you invest in us, what you get is exactly what's happening on the west side of Buffalo. With these kinds of investments. And because of the Community Leadership and Community Protection Act, Push Buffalo 3 years ago started planning its next housing project. And I'm excited to share with you that we put in an application to New York State Home Community Renewal for 49 units of housing on 12 scattered sites, 10 new builds, 2 rehabs that are all going to be built to net zero specifications, meaning they net zero. So they're the most sustainable without gas infrastructure, and they are affordable and supportive housing for people that are dealing with mental health issues, chronic addiction, as well as facing homelessness. And so I think that's the type of resiliency and equity that we want to talk about in the future. Thank you very much.
Rahwa, thank you so much. Such inspiring work, and I'm sure people have questions already, so we'll get into that too. I'd like to move on to our next speaker. We're moving east. Wade Norwood is the Chief Executive Officer of Common Ground Health in Rochester. He has held leadership positions for more than 3 decades, including roles in public service, education, and healthcare. Mr. Norwood has spearheaded Common Ground's efforts to engage underserved populations in health improvement, championing the creation of the African American Health Coalition, the Latino Health Coalition, and the Partnership for Access to Healthcare. His leadership roles at the state and local level include co-chairing the New York State Health Department's work group on healthcare workforce. Since 2009, he has served as an at-large member of the New York State Board of Regents. Mr. Norwood is also president and senior pastor at the Holy Jerusalem Spiritual Church. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Rafe. Appreciate that gracious introduction. And good morning, all. Thank you for joining us. I am delighted to be here. And Rafe, you can pull up slides whenever you're ready. And I would say to you all that I come to this conversation and I come to health planning really more as an expert in state and local government. Now, I have 30 years of experience in state and local public office. That includes 16 years serving as a member of my city of Rochester's City Council. And I would say to you as we approach this subject, and if you can put the slides in full screen mode, right? I would say to you that I approach this topic that the pathway to recovery and to cultivating recovery at the local level, the pathway is the people. I am the CEO of Common Ground Health, next slide please, which is the regional health planning entity for the 9-county Finger Lakes region. We see it as our mission to bring focus to regional health issues through our research, data, and analytic, through our community engagement, and through the collaborative partnerships in which we participate or that we build for collaborative action towards transformation. The magic of our work is really done through the 25 different cross-sector tables that we convene. The graphic here is an attempt to try and capture visually that those 25 tables involve more than 245 organizations in our community and more than 550 active volunteers who sit at those tables. Next slide, thank you. I'll show you 2 of my favorite cartoons. There's an animation in this cartoon. It is a map of the Finger Lakes region, showing the region by zip code. Lake Ontario at the north, the Pennsylvania border to the south, Buffalo, our western neighbor, Syracuse to the east. And each zip code is color-coded to reflect the socioeconomic status of the folk who live within the zip code. Socioeconomic status being a composite measure of occupation, unemployment, per capita income, the poverty rate, and household composition. And I hope that it is very clear to you that in the Finger Lakes region, poverty is not relegated to the inner city of Rochester or the city of Elmira. And I think that what's true for our region is probably true for your region as well, because all of upstate New York could tell the very same story. Although we are viewed as being this bucolic community of wealth and affluence in a state dominated by New York City, and this myth that that is where all the poverty of the state exists, you all know the very truth is the opposite. That upstate New York is characterized by wide swaths of poverty, and that the face of poverty does not look like Wade Norwood's face, that it looks like the face of all of us. Next slide, please. And our work has really focused in on trying to make clear that when we draw the very same map, and this time we color code for premature death, for years of potential life lost, what we're able to really understand is that poverty is literally killing us in upstate New York. Next slide, please, Rafe. And so we at Common Ground Health have a more than 50-year history of providing the data and the analytic that tries to get at what's going on that creates this unequal picture of health across our region. We have spent lots of time making sure that we're able to dive into these disparities, not only in terms of socioeconomic status, but also in terms of race and ethnicity. We publish on a regular basis with the guidance and the active informing of our African American and Latino health coalitions, detailed studies on the status and the nature of disparity by race and ethnicity. But we have become very concerned since 2017 about our ability to stop talking only about what's going on and start delving into why. And so in the summer of 2018, we administered a region-wide survey that really was a conversation with our neighbors. My wild, audacious goal was to be able to get 2,500 responses to our survey. We wound up getting 6,855 completed surveys back. And that really gives us the ability to start delving into some of the why. Next slide, please. And I would say to you, I could do a whole 2-hour presentation just on our survey, but I will spend 1 minute and 1 slide to share with you that the most dramatic takeaway for me was what this survey told us about mental health. When we asked adults in our region to talk to us about mental health, and we had 12 open-ended responses. And I want you to know that when people spoke to us of mental and emotional health, they did not use words like depression or schizophrenia. What they did was they talked to us about helplessness. What it feels like when year after year, you have too much month and not enough money. They talked to us about anger, that feeling of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they talked to us about behavior, destructive towards others and destructive towards self. And it really poses the question that the writer posed long ago. And keep in mind, this was in 2018, before we saw the demand for racial reckoning in the nation. What happens to a raisin in the sun? It doesn't always dry up. Sometimes it explodes with rage. Rafe, if you take me through and you can go ahead and animate this slide, because friends, I want you to understand the nature of poverty in upstate New York is that it really is not just one thing that erodes people's ability to report that their mental and emotional health is good or very good. It really is this essence of one thing on top of another. And I think that we do a terrible job of thinking about the nature of rural poverty, where there's social and spatial isolation, and there the transportation barriers are so great. that we saw in the Finger Lakes region, that over half of the adults who tell us that they live in a household with income less than $25,000 in a neighborhood, urban, suburban, or rural, that's not safe, facing transportation barriers, 54% of those adults told us that their mental health was fair at best or poor. Rafe, please. I've got 3 slides to go and 3 minutes to go. I'm sorry, I got 6 slides in 3 minutes. So I'm 30 seconds a slide from here. I want you to know that the incredible pathway that is available to all of our communities is to remember the incredible power of the people. Oppressed people, whatever their level of formal education, Ella Baker said, have the ability to understand and interpret the world around them, to see the world for what it is, and to move to transform it. When I served city council, my colleagues, both appointed and elected, really looked at the barbershops and beauty salons on every street corner, the storefront churches, as being a blight on the city, because they didn't know the people. Next slide. Those places are our sources of strength. And we've been able to, as the health planning entity, engage those venues in health education, in health promotion. They've been the locations where all of our students and residents in the health professions have gone for service learning and to really learn how to engage in cross-cultural communication. And as a result, over the last decade, we've been able to achieve a 43% drop in high blood pressure rates within our region. And in certain parts of the region, we have eliminated the racial disparity in blood pressure control among those who are the most dangerously out of control. Next slide. I tell you, we've also taken this work out into the community. We've taken it to the streets through our story walks around libraries, having kids engage in neighborhood beautification and reclamation of their neighborhood. We've had a play walk installed downtown with the support of our business community through our Rochester Downtown Development Corporation and our city government, so that kids are seeing downtown as a place for them and for their families to engage in physically active leisure time. And this intersection, our Complete Streets Makeover, so successfully slowed down speeding traffic in a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, that the city of Rochester is now making these improvements permanent through redesign of the street, literally making health improvement concrete. Next slide, Rafe. So whereas I sat on the city council, and we brought in professionals to guide us and help us do city planning, the word health was only mentioned twice in the city's master plan. This current master plan that was just enacted by the city council, because of the engagement of the people, the word play occurs 120 times. 188 times, I'm sorry, looking at my own slide. That's what happens when you get the people involved. What happens is that you really begin to get language written in the city policy that speaks to the lives of real people. Last slide. People are the pathway. And what we have found is that the only thing lacking to ensure that community conversation generate less heat is data and opportunity. And we believe that data and opportunity are the light that can be brought into community conversation. And we truly find that if you give people light, people will find the way. Thank you very much. Sorry to be 2 minutes over. It's back into your hands, Rafe.
Thank you so much, Wade. This is all just such great stuff. I could listen to you all day. All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Juhanna Rogers. She's Vice President of Racial Equity and Social Impact at Centerstate CEO in Syracuse. So we're moving down the Erie Canal east now. Previously, Dr. Rogers served as Centerstate's Director of Community Engagement and Empowerment within its Economic Inclusion portfolio. Prior to working at Centerstate, she was the Director for Health Services at Syracuse Community Connections. Achieving racial equity and driving systemic change continues to drive her professional work to date. Her prior work on race issues includes national and international work in the Caribbean, United Kingdom, and Central America. So welcome, Juhanna. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Good still morning, everybody. I'm excited to be here today. One, to be a part of such a dynamic panel. The previous panelists just have me so intrigued, and I'm honored just to be a part of the conversation with them. My presentation today is going to reference the work that I am leading, but am doing so in concert with a dynamic group of people out of an organization in Syracuse. I'm going to share my screen. The organization that I represent is Centerstate CEO. We are a business leadership organization. We do work from working with entrepreneurs to, we're a chamber of commerce, a political advocacy firm, as well as an economic development organization. And so in my previous role, I did a lot of work around community engagement, as we've seen in the presentations prior to mine, a lot of like, how do we mobilize the people, right? The people is our purpose, the people is where the intention and the impact of our work should be felt. Before coming into my role. My current role is Vice President of Racial Equity and Social Impact. I am leading the organization and developing a rollout of services that is working on, I think, a little bit the other end of the spectrum. It's working to challenge our business leadership within Central New York, across Central New York, to think about the intentional ways to disrupt systemic injustice, racial inequity, social justice, diversity and exclusion. How do we dismantle the existing systems and recreate them? And I have been in this position for just about 6 months, but I'm really excited about it. Another lens I bring to this work, I'm also an entrepreneur. So working as the granddaughter and daughter of entrepreneurs, I come to this work out of an experience that has been shaped by men and women of color that have tried to find a way, create a level playing ground for their children and legacy. And so I bring that lens of being an entrepreneur, having the privilege that I've been asserted or granted, if you will, to experience life through the lens of entrepreneurship to this work within the organization. And as my introduction stated, I'm also a trained critical race scholar. That is where I've spent the past 10 years doing a lot of work with scholars across the country at this volatile time. And so my work within Centerstate CEO, I bring all of those lenses with me. I'm thinking about nonstop, how does entrepreneurs, MWBEs in this community and other communities thrive and survive and become a fabric and a part of what we're trying to preserve when it comes to the economic growth and economic opportunities. How have they been historically left out of many of these practices? I often tell the story of when I took this job. My father, who himself was an entrepreneur as well, asked me, why was I taking a job at the Chamber of Commerce? They are not known for wanting to help people that look like me. And he thought, well, I thought that's what you wanted to do. And I thought that was really striking because in my upbringing of renting out apartments and watching my family perform their services, never heard mention of a Chamber of Commerce or anything of that light. They just had to figure out a way to make it work, have enough capital to operate and survive. And so I think about that as I go into this work each day, that there are many people who have not benefited from the existence of organizations like Centerstate CEO. And so how do we work ourselves internally to think more critically about that reality? What are our systems? And what is it that we have to think about as we lead this work? And part of what I challenge my colleagues as well as the leaders I sit around the table with is to think about the Sankofa principle, an African ideal, that in order for us to see where we're going, we got to understand our past, and not just the past of the people who have been oppressed, and understanding all the disproportionate ways that we have been pushed out, left out, intentionally eliminated when it comes to certain opportunities to receive assistance or scholarships or funding or housing opportunities because of the color of our skin, but how that history and those systems that were created to do that are still permeating across societies today and in communities like Syracuse, right? And so one of the things that I tend to do with my colleagues, as well as the business leaders that I'm having this conversation with, is think about the racial problem, which W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in The Souls of Black Folks back in 1903, and how that was going to be one of the greatest problems of the 20th century. Well, it's not just the greatest problem of the 20th century, but regardless if we're dealing with the current health crisis or global pandemic, or thinking about entrepreneurship or access to capital, the line and the problem of the color line, race still speaks. It screams out at us. And so one of the things that I challenge my colleagues and the community here to think about is that how have these historic incidents that have destroyed or handicapped the development of a vibrant, economically vibrant, a healthy African-American community specifically, but we could also apply this same history to other communities as well. How do we acknowledge those things, think about the systems that were created around them, or the injustices that were allowed to seep through those systems that we still carry forth today, right? Because that's why we are where we are. When we look at health, when we look at economic, when we look at energy or climate change, the impact at the bottom line is that it's going to disproportionately continue to disenfranchise folks of color unless we do something about it. As we're having these conversations, we're looking at business leadership and the cultivation of workforces within our organization. And as we take a look at the realities of these matters, we see that the history that impacted the development of folks of color still comes up as barriers to opportunities for growth today. When we look at board leadership across various industries, both from a racial but also gender perspective, again, folks of color still seem to be in a position, in fewer positions. When we look at leadership and entry into the workforce, which our economic inclusion team does a lot of work around when it comes to companies and think about building inclusive workforces. We again try to help people to understand the ways in which in a workplace we have people that enter it, and then there are folks that build a career trajectory. And when we think about career trajectories, again, folks of color, women of color, men of color, instead of seeing a growth incline there, we see a steep decline in their progress. So what story does this tell us about earning potential, career advancement, and the diversity of thought at the leadership of our organizations? These statistics are national, but how does that play out against the performance of graduates, professionally trained individuals that have the potential to lead? They exist, but why aren't we matriculating in ways that is changing the face of leadership in our country? One of the things that we begin to think about is the cost of normalcy. Many folks are saying, well, Juhanna, this is how it's always been done. This is our network. We have this process in place. Well, that process in place keeps us in a place where our leadership and our organizations continue to look like the images we see here. right? And that leadership, while it has gotten us to a place, will cost us in the future as we think about the gaps in earnings that are still maintained, as we think about the growing diverse workforce, if we don't address the inequities in pay, for example, that will continue to have negative repercussions on our growing economy as a nation. Right? So that's another way we're challenging folks to think about the way that they do business. We have examples where we highlight where stars that have the financial capital to invest have chosen to invest with companies that are more reflective of the realities of today than they were of yesteryears. And so one of the things we want to continually show folks is that the status quo, or what has been the status quo, is not creating a space where folks like myself can thrive, where individuals are looking to continue to take place and create spaces in communities, small communities like a Syracuse, if they can't find the opportunities that they're looking for, that in a healthy, emotionally, spiritually, culturally affirming way. We're choosing to just do something else. How does this also permeate across lines when we're thinking about entrepreneurs, when we're thinking about how do we create revenue generation for individuals that are suffering from matters of racial battle fatigue, microaggressions, as a relation to the policies and environments that exist within corporate culture? And I know time is winding down, but as we think about all of these matters that are affecting the business community, that is impacting economic growth for a small city like Syracuse, we have to do something to begin to dismantle it if we are going to have the opportunity to thrive and survive in the way that we imagine, right? And so one of the things as an organization, we are rolling out trainings for our business, for our members, but also for larger communities that's helping them create spaces for conversation. Our racial dialogue series, we've created a C-suite experience that's helping them think about the vision for equity. How can, we've been in business 50 years and our staff is all white, but we want to do something different. How do we get there? We're working with our managers and directors within these companies as well to talk about how do we manage differently? How do we build inclusive services? How do we think more about partnering with nonprofit entities or entrepreneurs in a different way so that we yield different results? In addition to that, we're having ongoing presentations and conversations to create spaces where folks become more familiarized with terminologies and concepts and ideas to understand how systematic injustices or systematic racism, to be quite blunt about it, is permeating throughout our society. And we help them understand that through organizational assessments prior to, ongoing, or even post our engagements. We really believe at Centerstate, this is what's going to help Central New York as well as Syracuse take a foot towards a more equitable system and set up a model that we think we can talk about on a national platform. Our February 1st, we're launching equity toolkit, which will be online for many of our members of the community as well as members of our chamber. And one of the things we are including in that toolkit is an equity pledge, and we're asking companies to take on that pledge and commit themselves to actions and strategies that are going to drive more inclusive practices as well as help diversify the bottom line for folks.
Thank you so much. That was great. Really inspiring work. Again, running a little bit over time. That's okay. We're adjusting. We're flexible. We're pivoting. This is all good work. So I'm believing in this. Our last speaker, not last but not least, Adam Zaranko, is president of the New York Land Bank Association and the executive director of the Albany County Land Bank Corporation, a nonprofit organization committed to revitalizing neighborhoods and strengthening communities through the reclamation of tax foreclosed, vacant, or abandoned real estate. Prior to joining the land bank, Mr. Zaranko worked for the city of New York and served under 2 mayoral administrations, most recently as a senior policy advisor in the mayor's office. Adam has over 14 years of experience in public policy, economic development, strategic planning, and asset management, and holds a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm glad I get to go last. I'll go quickly so we have time for questions, but I really enjoyed the previous speakers, the topics, and I found it very inspirational and motivating for some of the work that we're doing here at our land bank. And so what I hope to do today is just share some of that work, our kind of unique position in the housing space to address some of the challenges facing communities across upstate New York, and programs that I think can be applied to other areas upstate and across the nation. And maybe even if I can change the way you think about vacant and abandoned properties, or get you thinking a little differently about the opportunities they can provide. So sharing the screen here. So, you know, this is what I hear a lot, and I've been at the land bank in Albany County for going on 5 years now, and we do a lot of conversations across the state in my capacity as president of the Land Bank Association. And a lot of people say, you know, oh, we have this big problem. We have vacant and abandoned properties everywhere. They're concentrated in our neighborhoods. They're harming our cities. They're draining our municipal budgets, and they're a huge problem. And that's all true. And then you see images like what's on the screen, and you think, you know, these are really devastating, harmful assets. And, you know, this is a huge problem. What are we going to do about it? Should we just knock them all down? How did it get this way is a question we get a lot. And, you know, and some people conversely say, well, how bad are they to have some vacant buildings here and there, or what is the true cost? Well, this is a quick slide, and I won't go into too many details, but these properties, having vacant and abandoned properties, are very, very expensive with respect to both direct and indirect costs, and the negative externalities that these properties impose on local governments, on communities, especially the communities where they're located, which tend to be underserved communities with underserved populations, communities of color. They're harmful for all the reasons that you know, but it even gets into some of the things that previous speakers talked about, which is, you know, there's correlations between the prevalence of vacant and abandoned properties, mental health, chronic illness, even childhood literacy rates have seen studies on. So these are bad, right? We know these are bad. But one of the things that we're trying to unpack through the work we do here is answer the question, well, how come it's so bad? Like, how did it get this way? And it's very complex and complicated, and I don't pretend to know all of the ins and outs, but I like to simplify things into a couple different, you know, 2s or 3s really, if possible. So this is a very straightforward simplification, but, you know, working backwards chronologically, you know, 2008 foreclosure crisis hit the residential housing market very hard. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Most of us are well aware of that. We lived through it. You know, New York State was hit particularly hard with foreclosures. And what I think a lot of people lose sight on is a lot of neighborhoods are still on the ropes and haven't recovered from 2008. And some areas may never recover, frankly, in parts of the state, in parts of the country. And I think that, you know, we focus a lot on economic recovery, and that was over 10 years ago, but this is still something that we're trying to reverse the impacts of that crisis today. Going back a little bit further before the 2008 is, and this is for my planning friends here, this is, you know, suburban migration, also known as white flight, also known as the advent of the interstate system. All these things are interrelated, but this hit upstate cities particularly hard. You can see this chart that I put together that we pulled from our New York State Land Bank Association report. But really all this shows, if you want to look at the Albany County, the blue one here is the one we're familiar with. It's from the 1950s to 2010. You saw the hollowing out of our urban cores, our cities. And so those with economic mobility and the ability to go buy a home in the suburb through the incentives, to have an automobile, to use the highways, to leave the city, left the city. And you see in Albany County, almost a percentage per percentage point left the city and went to the surrounding county. So county population grew, but the city of Albany, which is the seat of our city, declined. And that's pretty consistent for most upstate cities during this period, except Buffalo. Buffalo saw, and we heard earlier from Rahwa, that we heard that, you know, population decline there was very measurable, and that population also seemed to have migrated out of the county. So that created an imbalance of housing supply, and it further compounded the issue, which dates all the way back to the 1930s and before. But this is the redlining practice. We've been hearing a lot about it over the past year or so. This is the intentional discriminatory practice of not allowing certain racial groups or ethnic groups to build wealth by not lending and not financing business ventures or home purchases especially. And so this is the official redlining map for the city of Albany. And so on the screen here, this is West Hill, Arbor Hill, and Sheridan Hollow. And this is the south end. If you're familiar with Albany, this white spot here, this kind of grayed out spot, this is the state capitol, and this is the Hudson River. So really, our capital is surrounded by areas, neighborhoods that were intentionally redlined. So this was 1938, and these were very harmful practices, and I think most folks are pretty aware of that damage. But what we don't really think about is the lasting legacy of that damage. So this dot map is an overlay of all of our organization, the Albany County Land Bank's real estate acquisitions, mainly comprised of tax foreclosed, vacant, and abandoned property, beginning in 2014 and ending, this is through July, but it hasn't changed much if you updated the dots here. This is probably, if you take something away from today's presentation, this is probably the biggest thing. The legacy of the intentional policies and discrimination dating back to the 1930s and before, compounded especially with all those other factors, as we're still feeling that today, and very much so. And that has set back entire neighborhoods for generations. And so we are trying to understand that as best as we can here at Land Bank here and the Land Bank across the state, so we can start to think about ways to address and start to be part of the solution and use what we can to turn things around. And so this is just, again, this is the same neighborhoods. This is the 2010 census data. This is demographic distribution by race, a racial dot map. And so you can see that largely, almost entirely, communities of color, African-American communities in the city of Albany correspond almost to the block with the red line areas dating back to the 1930s. That legacy has caused a lot of challenges, and I think a lot of folks don't think about Albany as having, issues that maybe people think can correlate with larger cities or larger metropolitan areas. But this is what the data shows. These are some recent studies around the racial gap between white and black home ownership rates. You can see that no matter which way you slice it on different studies, we can argue, are we the third worst or the fourth worst, but we're among the worst regions and cities in terms of black home ownership rates in the nation when compared to 100 of our peer cities. Buffalo is also on one of these lists, and I don't suspect it's much different in Syracuse or Rochester. And all of those things we just described have led up to this. And we're thinking about this a lot at our organization because we're definitely in a position, we feel, to help address some of this. And then obviously today we're thinking very much about COVID-19 and the disproportionate impacts, and just yet another devastating blow to the communities that have been experiencing a lot of the things I just highlighted. What's going to be different, we think, in the practice of community development, at least around the housing, is that unlike 2008, which is almost entirely residential real estate, we'll be seeing unprecedented numbers of tax foreclosed or foreclosed commercial or industrial properties coming out of the COVID-19 shutdown over the next couple of years. A lot of small businesses close down and can't make rent. That means their landlords can't make rent. That means very similar waterfall situation like we had in 2008. But when we think about building community resiliency through our line of work, which is focused primarily around real property, reclaiming vacant and abandoned properties, we think about creating stable housing as a way to kind of serve as a platform to create stability for the neighborhood, for the families or individuals living there, upon which we can build on solving the myriad other social justice issues that we've talked about. Previous panelists, and we're all pretty much very well aware of, especially those of us that have been learning over the past year and listening. We see that just one way to think about improving neighborhood stability is to foster, more home ownership. It's not the only solution, and there's a huge need for affordable housing and an tremendous unmet need for demolition. I'm sorry, not for demolitions, for affordable rentals. But we're thinking of home ownership too. We're thinking of that gap, and we're thinking about our role there. And why that's important is that you can start to kind of reverse that denial of intergenerational wealth building and create opportunities for people that have been denied those. And so we want to change the narrative. We want to change the way people think about vacant abandoned properties, and not to think of them as just huge problems, but opportunities, and opportunities to build equitable, inclusive, and resilient cities the way we know they should be and the way that we want them to be. So one tool for that is land banks. So we have land banks are essentially in New York State nonprofit entities that work with communities, local governments, and we focus our toolkits. We're provided special powers under state law, which is very similar to other land banks in the nation, needed to address vacant and abandoned properties. And so this is the way that we think about land banks here in Albany County, as a platform to work among all these different stakeholders and use our real estate to enable outcomes that weren't possible or very unlikely through traditional ways of disposing of tax foreclosed vacant and abandoned property. And I'm going to highlight just two of those today. And this is there's 26 land banks in the state of New York. We have one of the strongest networks of land banks in the country, and it's growing. We can have up to 35 land banks. You see a lot of the upstate footprint is served. All of the cities represented from the previous speakers have land banks, very effective land banks. They could always use more investment and more support, but what I'm about to describe is possible in any of these areas. And so why is a land bank different? Here's a quick snapshot of why. We sit between local government and the private real estate market, and we can basically create outcomes that weren't possible before. We don't just look for the highest bidder like the tax auction, and we don't just sell properties and hope for the best through like the private market to recover money. So what we were thinking about is, over the past year especially, we've been trying to unpack some of the barriers to home ownership. And what we've heard is this is what's blocking the pathway for a lot of folks that have been denied opportunities. Access to affordable real estate, the experience, the capacity, the education, the know-how. There hasn't been, family-owned homes that pass down that information generation to generation. It's people going into it for the first time, especially rehabs. Access to capital is the biggest barrier that we've seen time and time again, and I believe that's the case in probably every city that's trying to accomplish similar goals. And then a difficulty finding contractors or skilled trades to work on the rehab of vacant buildings, especially given that a lot of them are in distressed neighborhoods, and a lot of contractors say covertly or overtly sometimes that they do not want to work on vacant properties or in certain neighborhoods. So what we basically did was try to address all of those issues to create this pathway to home ownership by putting together special programs, creating partnerships to address some of this educational and capacity piece, and working with financial institutions and trying to find local contractors. And I won't spend too much time on these, because I know we want to have some conversation, but we have two pilot programs underway. The first one is designed to put all that together into a pathway and use our flexibility as a land bank and our powers and our partnerships to create a pathways to home ownership for people that didn't have it through traditional means. And this is all on our website, but this is a program that's underway, and we probably sold about a half dozen properties through this. All buyers who would not have been able to get those pieces in place through a traditional real estate purchase to create home ownership. And then this is another exciting one, is our partnership, our joint partnership with the Albany Community Land Trust, which is a large land trust, very well established here in Albany. And basically all this really is the land trust has had difficulty getting properties into their model, permanent affordability, in stronger neighborhoods. And our land bank does acquire properties in stronger neighborhoods, more affluent neighborhoods through tax foreclosure. And we basically flip it around and say, we will provide opportunity for their land trust to acquire properties in neighborhoods where they couldn't get real estate, so they can then put it in their permanent affordability model and sell that home through the land trust model to a family or an individual of low income, so they have an opportunity to have real property in stronger neighborhoods. And over time, we hope to create pockets of affordable housing in neighborhoods that the market would just never support that outcome. And so I know that was a lot, and information on both of those is on our website, but I want to leave time for Q&A. And this is another takeaway. Land banks are misunderstood in a lot of areas. They're still relatively new entities, but all of these things we're talking about, all the outcomes that we want to create, all the reimagining our cities, all of the affordable housing ideas are amazing. But if you can't control the sites, if you can't control the real property, you can't achieve any of those outcomes, or it's much more difficult. And so this is my pitch. Please support land banks. Think about creating land banks. Think about investing in your existing land banks, because this is one pathway that's available to a lot of cities in upstate New York to do the things that we want to do. And it's probably one of the best opportunities we have to do it. So thank you for your time and your interest. And that's all I got today.
Great, thank you. Well, can I ask all of the panelists to come online here? So our conversation time is a little abbreviated, but that's okay, because I think all of your presentations were so good and gave us so much rich fodder for thought. I wanted just to start the conversation, and please, audience members, put your questions in the chat. I mean, in the Q&A stream, and we'll try to get to them. Rahwa, you've been a master at answering questions on the fly, so please look at her answers. They were great. One of the things that the commonalities that come up in a lot of your work is this idea of empowering local communities to be a kind of co-creator in the process, right? To kind of upend the traditional sort of community engagement model of going into a neighborhood where you're not from, trying to get a few answers out of people and sort of walking away with an incomplete picture. Rather, it seems like a lot of the work that you're doing is flipping that on its head and really making the residents the drivers of the vision. So maybe we'll start with you, Rahwa. How do you mentioned this, that the people who are living in it know best, right? So how does this model work in your work?
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief. We have a saying at Push. Visit our website, www.pushbuffalo.org, and you'll see what our values are. So these are 15 years old, designed by the members themselves, and that is what we still continue to iterate and evolve, is that concept. And what we always say is that we know what we want where we live, and that we can be resident designers, planners, and implement these things. So if we just bring the resources here and give us like just the time and space, we will build what this community wants and needs. And our projects tend to be much more forward thinking, much more sustainable, much more comprehensive. And when we think about the triple bottom line sort of impact, around building what Adam was talking about, generational wealth, around what Dr. Juhanna Rogers is talking about, and even Wade Norwood, is that it brings back sort of our, it empowers us to know and believe, like these tiny little wins of we're rebuilding the neighborhood the way we want it to be. It just gives us a whole different perspective, especially as we think about equity and racism and economic inequality, that we can do these things for ourselves. So I think that's what we need to be like really holding on to. And the other thing that I would also say for us and how we work is that a solution right here in the west side of Buffalo may not be the solution if you go to the east side of Buffalo, just a few miles away, because the environment and the people are just a little bit different, meaning the challenges and the opportunities are different. But if you use the framework that we use about actually empowering the residents to decide about what would best be like an intervention here, it's gonna be amazing and beautiful and sustainable.
Others want to jump on that? How do we kind of co-create these visions with the communities that you work with?
The only thing that I would add to Rahwa's response, which I thought was spot on, is how important it is to be more respectful of relationships than of titles. There's a difference between power and positional authority. And I have found that trusting those thought leaders to be the people who tell me who else needs to be involved is far more supportive of driving transformation than trying to look at somebody's published directory of who's who in the community, because those things often overlook the real leaders that are making a difference at the street level.
Um, Thank you both for that. We've had a couple questions about the kind of moment in time that we're in. We're seeing shifting demographics in our upstate cities. We're seeing people moving in, moving out. How would you characterize kind of where we are in this moment of time, early 2021, going forward? I mean, what's your vision for how we're going to see our way out of this current pandemic, but also instill some of the kind of long-term resilient values that we've all been talking about? What's our kind of path forward, I suppose, given that there's so many variables at play? Anyone can jump in.
I'm gonna jump in there because I'm really excited about the moment that we're in. As a child of the 90s, I guess I would say it seemed as if the late 60s or the civil rights movement into the early 70s, the Black Power movement, was this romanticized ideal in time where change and opportunity and formation and policies were evolving that should have help to sway the system in a particular direction. And I think, it moved the needle, and then, things politically, economically happened, and the play out of those things were in some ways halted or got to a certain point. And I think as I look back on 2020 and where we're heading, there's this important moment that we're in where we have the opportunity to dig deeper and dismantle, hopefully, a number of the systems and practices that we didn't get a chance to address or didn't address thoroughly, or we've just seen them play out and it's not yielding the type of results that's really needed to build more equitable and inclusive communities. So as I think of the potential of panels like this, and what if there were ways to build bridges that really intersected the health work, the housing and economic development work, the grassroots organizing and partnership and the leadership that organizations like Push offers different communities. Like, if we're able to bring those together at a table with organizations like mine that has the political or economic capital to help really push agendas, we could see ourselves, right, maybe getting Du Bois to rewrite, post-mortem, of course, the problem of the next century in a different way, right? And sorry to take up so much time, but that is something I'm excited about. And I feel like, folks in my peers have the opportunity, and we're gonna be the folks that are gonna carry the mantle forward in a number of years as we hopefully evolve and our career trajectories puts us in the places where my presentation talks about we aren't currently occupying right now. As that shift occurs, we can do so, and the dynamics of that will trickle down and create different systems, hopefully. That's how I describe the moment.
I mean, from our land bank's perspective, it takes a few things. It takes, this is a rare opportunity. You got to think of COVID. You got to try to find some sort of silver lining to rebuild and recover and address the things that were done horribly wrong differently this time. So to foster long-term equitable recovery, one way to do it is even if we gave properties, just the properties are there, you need to invest. We need the cities. We need a lot of investment. You need to invest in the weakest neighborhoods first, the ones that have been disinvested intentionally over time. And two, you need to get access to capital in the hands of you need the properties, and then you need to get the money in the hands to rehab the properties or to build the properties and to right some of the wrongs of the wealth and turn that around. And then you need the partnerships. You need like the Push Buffaloes, you need like the land trust, you need the folks in the community, like Wade said, that have that kind of grassroots or on the ground lands. You need to mix all those together for the rebuilding pathway. And just like it needs to come together that way. Individually, it's very difficult, but it's one of those the parts together are greater than the sum. So like that's the way we're thinking about it, as we're kind of able to facilitate some of that, but you need those other ingredients in there. And that's just one piece of I think the rebuilding. And this is the time to do it. I mean, there's never been a time that it's as unprecedented. So
I think those were great responses, and I think Adam's right. this is the right moment. So I just wanted to pipe in to really commend the questioner for that question. And I would say to all on the call that keeping a constant view on these sweeping mega trends of changing institutions, societal shifts, what's going on with technology and the environment, Mother Earth herself, those keeping a firm eye and thinking about how our work plans and our mission work are being impacted by those mega trends. And we're finding the power at Common Ground Health of sitting with sister organizations and asking them, how are these mega trends impacting you? How are you responding? So that we move in concert. Shifting winds are going to always occur, but the key to sailing is to be able to tack. And as we tack the shifting winds, although it looks like we're changing direction, what we're really doing is staying on course, recognizing the shifting wind. And I think that this question of monitoring the mega trends is going to be a key for survival for those of us in the voluntary sector.
One thing I was impressed with all of you is your use of data, right? You're not just kind of whistling in the wind and throwing some anecdotes out there. You really lean into the work of numbers. You've studied your neighborhoods, you study your communities, which really empowers what you're saying. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that, how we can use data, how we can use numbers, how we can use these, looking at these trends, beginning to describe these really complicated factors at play, right? When we talk about equity, there's so many variables. How does this kind of looking closely at your communities, how is that a kind of key part of your work, would you say?
The one thing I like to tell folks is that the work that we're doing is not new, right? The narratives, the experiences of oppressed or marginalized people have been captured. I highlighted W.E.B. Du Bois, and I do that in part because people will try to make it seem as if these are new issues. And the data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, has been there and has been worked on. And the answers to a lot of the questions we're trying that are coming up now have been answered. And it's in the literary poses, it's in the data and calculations that have been reported over and over again. We've just brushed over them or not included them in our analysis. And part of the reason I tend to go back not only the theoretical framing, but examples of those things is to say, people will silence or ignore what they feel uncomfortable with, right? And as I said, the folks that have historically been around the tables leading sectors that we represent didn't know the answers, weren't exposed to the literature. And so when these opportunities come up to address equity or have come up, historically that data was ignored. And so I think it's important as a trained researcher to always center it around data. It can be manipulated, and so various points of data is important, but I use it more so to set a historical context that this isn't a new issue, that people have chosen to ignore them.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Rogers. I mean, I couldn't agree with that 100%. And then, coming from like the EJ framework, the environmental justice community, and how we've talked a lot about intersectionality and kind of the praxis of theory to practice, right? It is all based on really amazing research and information. But we also, doing community-based work is that we have local knowledge and inherent sort of like these relationships that Dr. Norwood was talking about, which are critical to everything that we do. Is that, I'm sorry, not Dr. Norwood, Dr. Rogers, Mr. Norwood, is that, there's so much nuance, right, with everything. And even the implementations, as Adam is talking about, and why is it important to have these collaborations, is that I know some things, he knows some things, collectively we know a lot of things, right? And so things will get missing. So that's why it's important to collaborate. And even when we talk about, the status quo, or the old systems and how we thought, they're very structured in a way where I call tunnel vision, right? And the reality is that doesn't work. If you actually want to build more resilient communities, it's like the mycelium underground, right? What happens in here, and it's the connectivity, it's the social fabric, it's, these solutions that are relevant to place. Because, I mean, like old policies of New York State, what they would do is they would treat this entire state like a monolith. We're not. If, Buffalo, New York is more like Midwestern city than it is New York City, right? And so we have to be thinking in terms of the policies that we create need to have that level of flexibility and resiliency themselves, so that when they're implemented in a region or a place, that it actually works in the way it's designed. Because I would argue that most policymakers, their intentions are very good to address equity, but most of them have never experienced, they don't have the lived experience of what it is that we need in this community right here to truly understand. So their policies generally fall flat. They don't work. We can't take advantage of that. So why do we, pushing a legislation like the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that's coming from the ground, that is addressed holistically all the different ways, whether it's, communities that have to transition from fossil fuels to communities that have been historically left out of these benefits to receive benefits, and addressing kind of like the larger context of, we have to stop, polluting the planet so that we have a planet to live on, kind of. So that's the kind of collaboration I think Adam is talking about, that actually make it more sustainable for the future.
And just on the data thing, I know the data for us, I mean, the data doesn't tell anyone that lives in the community something they're not already well aware of. We use the data to help communicate and create awareness. Both we're learning here at our organization because we have had this different experiences, and we're learning where we can be most impactful, but also sharing it with the others in positions to help address some of these issues. They need to be aware of what's going on. And, we all know real change is happening on the local level, and those folks need to drive that change. And so for us, that data is very helpful. But it's more about now, what's the outcomes? What are we going to do with that data? How are we going to make those changes?
So we're just about out of time, and as always with any good conversation, it feels like we could talk for hours. But I want to finish and try to collect a couple of the kind of threads of the questions from the audience. We have some questions from Mei-Ling about models of living, and I wanted to kind of wrap that up. Maybe can each of you just touch upon what you see the future of cities in upstate is, the kind of the potentiality of having these small, dense urban cores, right? Where each of you are working hard on kind of actualizing a lot of a new way of going about business, a new way of living healthfully, a new way of being a community with activated properties, of shifting demographics in neighborhoods. What gives you hope in the future of small and mid-sized cities in upstate, and in particularly in the context of the next crisis, right? How can we kind of create resilient small cities that, as Mr. Norwood was saying, surrounded by rural poverty as well, right? We can't see these cities out of the context of their counties. What do you see the kind of future of your community as, particularly when it pertains to this kind of legacy city?
I'm gonna just hop in because I have to hop to another conference call, but great question. I think for me, I'm not from Central New York. I'm actually from Newark, New Jersey. And I came here in the midst of my dissertation writing. And what I have found is that here in Syracuse, more so, it's large enough, it's culturally diverse, in ways that many other smaller cities, may be challenged, but there's a strong African American population, it's New American population, as well as the indigenous, right, community that's here. And if we're able to build a bridge based on our work, the potential opportunity of a representative community that has access to quality housing, economic prosperity, could really be a model of what I would call like a cultural mecca of Central New York, right? Most folks are rushing to Ithaca for that, and I'm like, Syracuse is right here. And I think one of the things that drives my passion for doing this work, as well as me choosing to be here, is that oftentimes folks of my my age and in my professional position at this time wouldn't be able to be at the table shaping these ideals. So we're leading initiatives around diversifying the tech industry, thinking about talent and retention. And if we're able to achieve that, you can come live, play, work here, and it's affordable. There's space for room and grow. And I know that's one of the things folks are looking for. So sorry to have to drop off, but thank you for the time, space, and
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you very much.
Well, I think it's such, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Adam, do you want to go?
First, no, go ahead.
First of all, it's such a great question. It's a question that, I mean, I live it every day, which is I really believe that a Rust Belt city like Buffalo, New York can be kind of the city of the future that is an example to the world. I love our size. I love, you know, the opportunities around actually creating a climate resistant city that could be so equitable. And it's hard because we're so like just a city that is plagued by history and racism and poverty. And I just see nothing but opportunity for my city. And part of that is we need to be able to practice distributed power and democracy. So I think we're the right size for that. I think, you know, our communities come up with really brilliant things like we want to own our own energy microgrid and power the transformation to the, you know, renewable energy. Like, so we're talking about, you know, the electricity sector has to be 100% electrified by 2040. We're ready for that. We want to build the workforce. We want to own the infrastructure that will allow for that. We want to build more mass transit. And again, it's like, this is, I think all of these opportunities aren't very far-fetched for us. They're very real and right in front of us. So it's about really getting our political sort of power brokers to have a level of courage, creativity, and vision. And if they don't have it, then rely on groups like ours that are actually trying to build the cities of the future where we center the people on the planet.
I should have went first because that was excellent. So I agree with all of that. I mean, that's pretty much, and then some, what I was thinking. I mean, and from a planning standpoint, as a planner, I mean, the bones of our upstate cities are sound, right? It's some of the policies and practices and outcomes have to change, but we have a lot of things that other cities across the country try to rebuild and emulate through different practices. So we have a good foundation, and I just think that, you know, upstate cities and cities our size are going to be the next centers for innovation and creativity, because we have to be out of necessity now, but also it's small enough where it's workable and manageable. But as Rahwa said, you have to be able to get out of your own way. You have to be prepared to change the status quo. You need the political will and the investment, and you need to shake it up a little. If you're not open to that, you're not going to get to where you need to be. So, you know, I think the future is in small cities, and we got a lot of them upstate. And, you know, I'm a big proponent, and not just New York, but New York has, you know, some of the best small cities, I think, personally. So
I will chime right in with my colleagues, Rafe, and say that this pandemic experience, I think, has reminded us all of what really is important in life. For me, it's the opportunity to just be with people, the chance to hug and to be hugged, to see entertainment that's live and not on a screen, that's an easy walking distance. I think we're being reminded of why cities exist, because human beings by nature are social animals. We need each other. And I think that the revival of cities is absolutely primed by the fact that as a nation, we understand that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And as a result, I'm incredibly grateful on behalf of my community that you were thoughtful enough to, as the Institute thought about the future of cities, to bring together neighbors. You could have invited any other communities to come in and speak truth. But what you did was you allowed us to turn to each other. And I think that that is absolutely the opportunity for us to remember that if we spend the time to share who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going, that's the very process, Ella Baker said, of how you change the system.
Wow, I got chills, even over Zoom. Wow, thank you, Wade and Adam and Rahwa and Joanna and all of you. Hopefully this is the beginning of, or the middle of a long conversation that's been going on and that will go on in the future. I really believe firmly that we're greater than the sum of our parts, so we got to continue this conversation across our cities. I think if we put all of our work together and all of our assets together, we can really do great things. And I'm with you that the future is in small cities. It's a really exciting year, and hopefully we will emerge from this pandemic stronger and more like you, more appreciative of what we have, because we have a lot. So we hope to see you at the next conversation. Thank you all to our panelists. Thank you all to everyone who showed up. You guys are the change makers. You're making the magic happen on the ground floor. So we're all grateful to you. So thank you. We'll see you next time.